immense historical, aesthetic and archaeological interest. The second is the dignified, beautiful and welcoming people. And the third reason for visiting Iran is that the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office advises you not to. Advice which is, of course, preposterous and entirely political. You feel safer and you are safer than in New York. Now, the demonization, the otherization of Iran is very interesting because in a sense it has a very long history. One of the really interesting things about Iran, from ancient history up to now, is the way in which it has preserved its autonomy and identity, despite being conquered by various peoples. Iran, of course, was conquered by the Macedonians, the Arabs and the Mongols and other people, but very quickly asserted its autonomy and identity, its language and its culture. And of course it still is a country which has eluded the American Empire. It was under the American Empire de facto from 1953 to 1978. In 1953, the British and the Americans replaced nascent Iranian democracy with the savage dictatorship, and that was in order to get a good share of their oil, which ended in 1978. But the Iranians now have autonomy and identity, and going there is, in a very minor way, also a political act, helping to end their isolation and to increase, thereby, one hopes, the liberalization of the regime. Now, I'm not an expert. I have no expertise in the subject that I'm going to talk about, but of course, talking about subjects in which you have no expertise is one of the more useful skills that we impart to our students. But the previous speakers are experts in what they've been talking about. I have been left to deal with the Sassanians. The Sassanians, hundreds of years from my expertise, that is to say from about 224 AD to 651 AD, when there was the Arab conquest. That is the Sassanian Empire at its greatest extent. Now, the first Sassanian king was called Ardashir I, who in 224 defeated the Parthian king, Artabanus V, and much of the extraordinary Sassanian reliefs that we visited that celebrate Sassanian victories and royal power. And here, this is rather an interesting relief. It's because you see two horsemen of the same size, and in the 17th century we know that the local people thought that this was Darius III handing power over to Alexander the Great after he was conquered by Alexander the Great. Why? Because it just looks like two kings, two males of equal status. And even as early as the early 19th century, it was thought that this was the king Ardashir handing over power to his son Shapir to be the next king. That was before Middle Persian was deciphered, and there are inscriptions on the horses apparently, which make it clear that the figure here on the left is Ardashir the first, and the figure on the right is Ahura Mazda, the Zoroastrian god, who incidentally is carrying the Barsham, which Richard Sterling has already spoken about. You may wonder who this figure here is. That is the Parthian king Artabanus, who was defeated by Ardashir. And you may wonder who this figure here is. Well, that is Ahriman, the god or spirit defeated by Ahura Mazda. So, first of all, notice you have equal status and size for king and god, which shows you a lot about how the Sassanian monarchy envisaged itself. And secondly, you have a clear parallelism between the military and political struggle in which the new Sassanian dynasty defeat the old Parthian dynasty, the Arsacids, and the cosmic struggle in which Ahura Mazda, the god of righteousness, defeats the evil spirit Ahriman. And if you're wondering what it looks like from the perspective of the defeated, there's a photograph that shows you the heads of the two defeated males. Now, of course, in celebrating military victory, in celebrating crushing your enemy, the Sassanian kings belong to a tradition that goes back to the Achaemenids. That's the famous relief at Bisitun, with Darius confronting his defeated and captured rebels, and indeed, earlier still, to Assyrian art, relief from Nineveh. Now, we move on to a site somewhat to the west of what we've seen already. This is in Nakshi Rustam, which is near Persepolis. Let me just say that most of the places I'm talking about are in this area here of Persis, or Fars as it's now called, and that was the place from which the Achaemenids came, and it was also the place from which the Sassanian dynasty came, and clearly the Sassanian dynasty are modelling themselves to a large extent on the Achaemenids. I'll come back to that point, that well-known point, shortly. I should say that one of the high points of me, now we've got the map up, is we're travelling through the mountains here, Tehran somewhere up here, to Hamadan, that was ancient Ecbatana, and down through these mountains into the plain, the rich plain of the Susiana around here. And of course, you have the immensely fertile plains of the Euphrates and the Tigris here. And to do so was to feel history rather than just to read about it, because this is, of course, the route taken by countless rugged semi-nomadic peoples from the mountains to the settlement and the wealth of the plain. And on that trip, I noted a number of semi-nomadic people in tents with their flocks. Semi-nomadism, or transhumancy, moving your flocks around for pasture, plays a big role in Iranian history, and there they still were. And of course, this was the route taken by, for example, the Medes, when these rugged people came down from the hills and destroyed Nineveh, the great Assyrian city, in 612 BC. So all that, just one example of the way in which being in Iran transforms your sense of ancient history. But to go back to these Sassanian reliefs, that is in Bishapur, and this is the son of Ardashir I, that's the second Sassanian king, Shapur I, and you will, I hope, be able to see that he has in front of his horse a kneeling figure, and he also has another figure which he's holding by the hand, and a third figure under his horse. These are Romans. Who are they? Well, if there's general agreement that the dead figure under his horse is Gordian III, who was the Roman emperor who was defeated by Shapur I in 244 of CE, but there's some dispute about who the two other figures were. It's agreed that they're Valerian, who was defeated by Shapur I in 260 CE, and Philip the Arab, who was Gordian's Praetorian prefect and succeeded him in the purple after Gordian was killed, and who eventually made a deal with Shapur I, which involved Philip giving the Persians very large sums of money and some territory. And people think the kneeling figure is probably Philip Arab because it looks as if he's negotiating, whereas the figure here is, it is claimed, Valerian, who came to grief, was captured by Shapur I 16 years later, so that the relief would be a conflation of two different historic defeats inflicted by the Sassanians on the Romans. And there we go from Bishapur back to Nakshi Rustam, where you have again two figures, one held by the hand, another on his knees, and once again that may well be Valerian and Philip the Arab. Now, I want you to notice in this picture the figure here in the background, a very significant figure. And that figure is also, and it is the same person, we know from inscriptions, that we find in this relief, the Rajab, again near Persepolis. Now, the impression you may have got so far of Shapur I is that he wasn't a very nice chap, that he was a brutal military man who liked nothing more than to trample with his horse over the body of his enemy. But what we have here is a fascinating text from a 9th century CE Pahlavi text. Now Pahlavi is a way of writing Middle Persian, and it's about religion in the time of Shapur I, who it is claimed collected writings from the religion, that's the Zoroastrian religion, which had dispersed throughout India, the Byzantine Empire, and other lands, and which treated of medicine, astronomy, movement, time, space, substance creation, becoming, passing away, qualitative change, logic, and other arts and sciences. These he added to the Avesta, and he examined the possibility of basing every form of academic discipline on the religion of the worshippers of Mazda, that's Ahura Mazda, the god of Zoroastrianism. Now, this is an enormously interesting text, it seems to me. One's immediately suspicious of it, because this is about the 3rd century CE monarch Shapur, but it looks like the Baghdad Caliphate of the 9th century AD, when the text was actually produced, in which the Caliph is welcoming knowledge from all over the civilized world and trying to integrate it into Islam. Or indeed, it may have been influenced by the later Sassanian monarch Khosrow I, who again presided over an international, intellectual, cosmopolitan court. And I really don't know what the Sassanian experts think about this, but it would be a very different picture from the picture you get from the reliefs. Now, it also is interesting about Zoroastrianism, which Richard discussed. There is a reference to the Avesta. Now, I have a certain interest in Zoroastrianism because of my interest in the Axial Age, which Richard also referred to. And there are very different sources for Zoroastrianism. First of all, there is the Avesta. Now, the Avesta, again, wasn't written down until very late. It is a text written in an early Iranian dialect from eastern Iran, Avestan, and it is the oldest Zoroastrian text we have. In fact, a lot of it was lost, but we have a chunk of it, of which the oldest part consists of the Gathas, which Richard said may have been written by Zoroaster himself. So that's one kind of evidence. Then you have this kind of evidence, the Denkart, which was written much, much later. It was in Middle Persian. This text is from the 9th century CE. There's a lot of other Pahlavi texts, and they give a rather different picture of Zoroastrianism, but they do tell you quite a lot about the Avesta, and indeed about early Zoroastrianism. So that's a text which dates from several centuries later, but it's about the same religion. Other sources for Zoroastrianism are inscriptions. The Achaemenid inscriptions, if we believe Richard and others who think that the Achaemenid religion was Zoroastrian, and the Sassanian inscriptions, which I'm going to come into a moment. You also have Greek and Roman sources on Zoroastrianism. It's notoriously difficult to put together these very different kinds of evidence to get a picture of Zoroastrianism. But this, if true, gives you a sense of a religion which is embracing philosophy and thought of the most sophisticated kind as early as the 3rd century AD. Right, now there's Cartier, who, this sinister figure, was the high priest of the Persian court in the time of Shapur I and his 2 successors. And this is from Naqsh-i-Rustam. Now, this is from the tombs of the Achaemenids, the 5th century tombs of the Achaemenids. And in the same place, as you can see, is a strange cube-like building called the Kaaba el-Zartust, which means the cube of Zarathustra, but it has nothing particularly Zarathustrian about it. But it is of the Achaemenid era, and it has a Sassanian inscription on it. That is to say, the Sassanians put inscriptions on it many hundreds of years after the Achaemenid tombs, and many hundreds of years after the building itself. So they, by putting the inscription on this, are making their claim to represent the continuity from the Achaemenid period of the Iranian monarchy. And there's an inscription which was inscribed by, or said to be inscribed by Kartir, the figure you've seen in the Sassanian reliefs, the high priest of the Sassanian Empire. And I just want you to look at the emphasized part of this. He says, and Jews, Sramans, that's Buddhist, Brahmins, Nazareans, Christians, baptizers, Zandics in the empire were smitten, and destruction of idols and scattering of the stores of the devs and god seats and nests was abandoned. That looks like a kind of policy which I don't believe the Achaemenids would be responsible for, of nationalizing Zoroastrianism and eliminating other religions, a policy of religious intolerance. But you can imagine that for many reasons this rather long document is extraordinarily interesting, and here you have an expression, a remarkable expression of religious intolerance. It's very interesting when you think, by the way, about how nowadays Iran is part of the axis of evil for the USA, and America is the great Satan for Iran. So you have these two cultures demonizing each other. I should say that the Methodist shadow people who devise American foreign policy have a fully fledged plan to attack Iran with nuclear and conventional weapons. Fortunately, our splendid American and Israeli allies did not incinerate us on this trip. But 2 or 3 years ago, there was much more likelihood that they would have attacked. The danger has somewhat receded. But Valerian, the emperor who was defeated by Shapur I in 257 BC, while he's fighting the Persians, sends a letter back to Rome with detailed instructions about persecuting the Christians. It looks like the first really serious persecution of Christians in 257. He does that while fighting the Persians. But about the same time, you're getting this evidence for religious intolerance in the great Sassanid Empire. There are other very interesting things about this inscription that I'm going on too long. But one little thing I can't resist pointing out is that in the second line you have a reference to the services of Ahura Mazda. And the Yazads, now the Yazads just means the other gods. What this means is that monotheism, that Zoroastrianism is not monotheistic. It's sometimes called monotheistic. And in particular in the early period, people talk of it as the invention of monotheism. In my view, it's never monotheistic. It is henotheistic, as Richard correctly called it, which henotheistic means you have one god who is far more important than all the others, but you do have other gods. So that's nice evidence for that in this inscription. Now, one or two more slides before I finish. We go to this is Bishopur, isn't it? Where you have this extraordinary, again, big relief of two powerful men on horses. Ahura Mazda here on the left is passing the diadem, embodying the royal power, to Bahram I, who comes to power about 272 CE. And then we have Bahram II, and this is a relief from the same place, Bishopur, which is, and these things are aesthetically, seem to me, quite extraordinary. Here you have the king on the left receiving what looks like either a delegation or a collection of prisoners. Of course, in the Achaemenid art, you have both delegations of foreigners and collections of prisoners. These people are Arabs. Of course, the Arabs, 4 centuries later, will take their revenge by invading Iran. But here you have Arabs, and in one of them you'll see the fingers have been cut off. So we'll have a close-up of that. It means you can't, less effective fighter. And finally, we have a slide from Taki Bostan, which is much further to the north, where we have the giving of the royal power, once again by Ahura Mazda, to Shapur II in the 3rd century CE. Behind him you see the Zoroastrian god Mitra holding once again the bundle of twigs that we've already seen in several slides. Well, I think I'd better stop there. So thank you for listening.